Are you able to exit this? Where is the option? I'm going to stop sharing this.
You're moving though.
Oh, that's.
There you go. We're good. All right, I think we're all set. So, thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Troy Fears. I'm the executive director here at Candles Holocaust Museum and Education Center. I want to thank those in attendance in person and also those online today. We have a large crowd online watching us today. So again, thank all of you for being here. Today we gather for Yom HaShoah, or Holocaust Remembrance Day, and we honor the memory of the 6 million Jews of Europe who were murdered in the Holocaust. We lift up the world, the voices of the survivors, and we continue to work toward a world where we all remember and remind each other to care about our fellow human beings. We come together tonight to honor and remember all the victims of the Holocaust, and we will begin tonight with a candle lighting ceremony.
We light this candle in honor and remembrance of the 6 million Jews who were touched by the displacement, dehumanization, and systematic murder that was the Holocaust. Also for family members that were murdered, the families that never even came into existence, and the families who were completely annihilated, lying in the unmarked graves who have no one left to mourn their loss.
We light this candle to remember the thousands of people with intellectual, developmental, or physical disabilities that were killed as part of the Nazis' euthanasia program. We refuse to allow the victims of the Holocaust to be forgotten in history.
We light this candle to remember the thousands of people who were destroyed for being different, for being themselves. This includes those who were oppressed and killed because of their gender identity, sexuality, and sexual identity.
We light this candle to remember the thousands of other religious minorities who were singled out for destruction. People labeled as others who were feared, despised, and murdered.
We light this candle to remember the righteous among the nations who stood up for justice and light and risked their lives to save fellow humans, even amidst the horror and darkness, and for the brave soldiers as actions of nations who liberated the campus and carried the near dead in their arms to a more human future.
We light a candle for those who live, even now, under the yoke of oppression in places throughout the world where the threat of genocide is real and ever present.
All right, thank you, everyone, and thank you for taking time out of your day, again, to remember and honor the 6 million Jews who passed away during the Holocaust. At this time, I would like to introduce to you Leah Simpson, who is the Candles Education Director, she will then be introducing our guest speaker for tonight. Leah.
Thank you, Troy, and thank you everyone for being with us today. So we also come together today to learn from those that survived. This connection to history pushes us to not only remember this atrocity, but to stand up when called to action, when called upon. As part of the Be the Change speaker series, Jean Kristeller is here to tell the story of her family. They were living in Berlin, Germany prior to World War II, but could see the changes on the horizon and fled their homeland. Ms. Christeller is a retired faculty member in clinical psychology from Indiana State University, and has been involved with candles and the museum in a variety of different projects throughout the years. There will be a question and answer session following her presentation, and for those of you online, please use the Q&A tab to pose your questions. Join me in welcoming Ms. Jean Kristeller.
Well, hi, it's great to see everybody, and I'm is that better? Thank you. Very, very honored to be here and to be able to take part. Yes, we'll go. There we go. And to be able to participate and take part in this special time that we are commemorating here at Candles. I have indeed been involved with Candles in one way or another over the years. I did get to know Ava fairly well in a couple of different ways, and so means so much to me that that was the case. So I'm going to be talking about what my family went through, both my immediate family and some of my relatives who actually I've learned about more over the years doing this kind of, well, presenting here on about 10 years ago on my great uncle, and then just reading into unpacking boxes from my father's home and things like that after he passed away a few years ago. So let me just say, I am going to try and save some time at the end for questions and answers, but if I do talk about something and you really do have a question because I wasn't clear, please feel free to raise your hand and I'll try and take care of it right then and there. I'd rather have that happen. What I'd like you to do is think about what if, we have good lives here. You have families, you have your work, you have your identification in various ways. What if it somehow happened that you realized you had to leave? You had to not only leave your community, you had to leave your country. You could take some things with you, but you couldn't take everything you had. Maybe there were people who you knew where you were going, but it wasn't the same as staying where you were, wasn't the same as staying here. You would miss your friends. You would miss your daily life. You would miss your work. So I'm not speaking for the most part about the horrors of the Holocaust, but certainly the impact of it much more broadly than we sometimes do think. So that is what I will be talking to. Yes, I go down. I want to acknowledge family members that I'm going to be referring to, or that helped me with pulling together some of the materials. My parents, my sisters and brother, Julie, Leslie, and Jeff, my grandparents, of course, who were the ones who did have to flee from their homeland. One of my cousins, Andrea, and a second cousin, Hannah, who also felt connections with all of that I'm going to be talking about. So this invitation to do this partly came out of, oh, there we go. Okay. If you recall, if you get the Trib Star or look at it, that on the first day of the Olympics last year, the newspaper ran on their front page a picture of Jesse Owens winning the gold medal in one of the track and field events. He actually won 2 golds and a silver. And I was really impressed that they ran this. And one of the reasons I was intrigued to see it was that my grandparents and my father and his sister Anne were there. And my father was, and they were sitting close enough to Hitler to see Hitler's reaction to Jesse Owens, an African-American man, win the medal. He was appalled. And my father didn't tell me this actually till a few years ago. He passed away actually about 5 years ago, and it was probably about 5 years before that he told me this. And I was like, really? You were there? Oh my goodness. And that is, I actually wrote a letter to the Trib Star about that. And, and then I got a call and was asked if I would share some of that story. Okay. And this was just, so this was my larger family on my father's side in 1903. This was my grandfather there. These are his parents, his brother Walter, his brother John, his sister Alice, and her husband Kurt Rosenfeld, who I will be speaking about a little bit more because of his importance in the German government. I want to give a little background of my father, though, just because I'm going to be referring to him, referring to some of the choices, decisions he made, and I won't have to, you'll get a feel for the flow. He was born in 1921 in Berlin. His parents sent him to a private school, the Französische Gymnasium, so he actually became fluent in French. However, when they were sending him in 1936, they closed the universities in Germany to Jews. And he had every intention of going to university. So they sent him to England to a private boarding school named Buxton Academy. I never thought to ask him why it was that they chose that place. And I went online and looked up Buxton Academy to find that the headmaster there had actually offered places in 1936, 35, 36, to German Jews, admission and free tuition to German Jews, something quite special. Now, was that the case for my dad? I don't know. I actually sent an email off. I didn't hear anything back. It was only a few days ago. So I'm hoping I will still. But even if he wasn't part of that group, I understand it was about a dozen boys. It was a boys' school. It's still the case that my grandparents might have become aware of this happening from friends of theirs who had also had sons the same age as my father, it wouldn't be too surprising. And so thought, oh, this would be a good place to send my father, George. But regardless, I wanted to acknowledge Buxton Academy for having done that. Now he finished at Buxton and he was admitted to university, City and Guild University in London, which is one of the top engineering schools in England. He made it into his third year of university when the Blitz started happening. The Germans started bombing London and bombing outside of London. My father was rounded up and put in an internment camp because he was German. The fact he was Jewish was not considered relevant. But what I did hear from my dad was that one, he was pretty educated. He spoke German, of course, and was a responsible person. And maybe it was because he also was German, but that he had a one-way ticket from London to New York, and that they realized that he really probably was of minimal risk. And so they released him on the agreement that he would leave, that he would get, and his parents were in New York at that point. I'm going to be coming back to that. His parents were in New York, so that was probably a pretty safe to release him. So he had to go back to his apartment. He said, and he had to let his roommate know that he was going to be moving out and pack up all his stuff. And of course, first make sure that ticket on the, he had a ticket actually. I was sort of a little surprised and shocked at this, but as I said, my grandparents essentially had to give up all their cash, their bank accounts, everything. But if they had spent the money on something about leaving, that was okay. So they had bought themselves and my dad first-class tickets on the Queen Mary. Well, unfortunately, by the time my dad was leaving, it was the Queen Mary was a troop ship, so he came across on something else. But he did have a ticket, and he was able to leave. He got to the U.S. In 42, approximately, to join his family. His English wasn't bad at that point. He'd been, of course, there in school for a few years. And he got a job at the swing line staple company because he had this engineering background, and his responsibility, because the war was underway, his responsibility was redesigning the swing line stapler to remove as much metal as possible for the war effort. And so I've sort of, swing line's a kind of stapler I always buy. But he decided that he wanted to become an American citizen. And the way to become an American citizen was to enlist. And so he enlisted in the Army. He did basic training. This amazed me. In Atlantic City in New Jersey in the convention center. I didn't know that either until we were all in Atlantic City about 15 years ago because my sister had a timeshare down there and we were doing a family thing. And we were out on the, I don't know if anyone here's been to Atlantic City, but we were sitting out on one of those in, cool little restaurants out on the wharf. It's a lot like the wharf in Chicago where it sticks out in the ocean and there's stuff you can. And my dad pointed back across onto land and he said, see that building there? That's the convention center. I said, yeah, Dad, I know. He said, well, that's where I did my basic training. I went, what? That's crazy. Okay, thanks for letting us know. Because we had actually lived in New Jersey for a while and he never mentioned it. This was actually part of how he was. He just pushing a lot of those things away. So he then tried to get a position as an engineer in some way, one way or another within the Army. He was blind he was actually legally blind if he didn't have his glasses on, so he couldn't be in the troop and with the troops in a war setting. And what happened is he was sent to, the Pentagon had just opened and they needed people there with multiple language skills. So he was sent there. And part of what he actually was pretty careful, strangely enough, to not let people know that he was German. His English was, he had an English accent still. He spoke French. He admitted he did speak German, but that wasn't, he sort of kept that low key. And one thing he did was handle telegrams in the European, with the European forces. And then, so the war ended in Europe and he was moved over to handle telegrams from the Pacific forces. At which point he became intrigued with what was going on in Japan. He also really did not want to be sent to Europe. He was afraid if he got sent to Europe, he would be pulled in. He had heard about men like himself who were pulled in to take charge of a town, like to be the acting mayor somewhere, so that the Nazi government could be removed and somebody that was trusted could be put into place. And he absolutely did not want to do that. So he volunteered to go to Japan when the war ended in the occupation forces. He worked actually in MacArthur's headquarters. And one of his first responsibilities was to go around all of Japan and make lists of all of the properties in Japanese factories that were still viable. Because at that point, right after the war ended, the US was basically going to strip all of those. And they wanted to know what was there and where to start. Things changed somewhat when they realized, this is somewhat pertinent to today, that if they did that, guess who was going to get a third of the properties that they stripped? The Russians. And they didn't want that to happen. So they changed their perspective, they changed their approach actually within the occupation to rebuild the Japanese economy. The other thing is, I think there was a strong group saying, look, one of the reasons World War II is happening is because we stripped Germany after World War I. And there's I'm not a scholar in that area, but there certainly was that contributed to both some horrendous inflation in Germany and also to a lot of unease there. So he was in Japan for about 5 years. Now, he also met my mother in Japan. My mother had gone over in the American Red Cross at the very end of the war, when the war was over, to Okinawa. And she was there for a few months until things really were quieting down. And then she volunteered to go to Tokyo to be a secretary in the occupation forces. And she was there for 2 or 3 years before she was introduced to my dad. And they became a thing. They became a couple, and they got married in Japan because they wanted to both stay there a little bit longer. And if they got married, they could actually they were living like in dormitories, they could actually get, like an apartment. That was part of it. I had understood, but they had I have pictures of their wedding. I'm not sharing those particularly, but they actually had a wonderful year. First, they did find an apartment, but then they did something you were also allowed to do, which was, well, you weren't supposed to do it, but they were sort of getting lax at this point because we're talking the 1950. They found a Japanese family who wanted an American couple to live in their home so they could teach their kids English. And they were actually a fairly sophisticated couple, and I'm still in touch with them. In fact, one of their great-grandchildren is about to spend a year up at Purdue, and I will be getting an email from him in a few weeks when he gets there. So that's sort of cool. And I've spent time in Japan. But long story short, they came back to the US at that point. I was born a few months after. So sometimes when I get asked, I say, well, I was made in Japan. And I actually have stayed in the room, in the home that they had rented for the year, which again is a little bit weird. So they returned to the Boston area because that's where my mother was from. Now, if you notice my mother's name, it is also here, Louise Stegelman. It's also a German name, but she was from, her father was actually born in Germany also, but they were a Christian family, and they had come to the US in about 1882. And her mother came from a sort of old New England background. So let's continue. So here is my excuse me. There's my grandfather, my grandmother, my father, my mother, and me. Outside my Nana's house in Watertown, Massachusetts, if you know the Boston area at all. And so I wanted to show you a little more updated photos of people, but I'm going to go back now and give you some of the background of their lives in Berlin. So this is, anyone here been to Berlin? Okay, so I've only been there once, It was about 20 years ago, but I wanted to see the places that my grandparents had known, where they had lived, where my dad had grown up, and sort of some of the places they went to. So my dad actually was able to give me the address of the house his mother grew up in. And that was on this little street here. That's the, I couldn't remember the address, but when I put in Monika Strasse, that's what came up into Google. I mean, it's amazing, right? And this is, if you've been to Berlin, this is the Zoostation, which is one of the central train stations in Berlin. My husband and I were coming over from Hamburg, and that's where we got off the train in Berlin. It's very close to the zoo, which is a corner of it there. Kurfürstendamm, which is this street, is sort of the Fifth Avenue of Berlin. And this is Kurfürstenstrasse. No, that's Kantstrasse, but this is Kurfürstenstrasse up there, which is maybe, if you know New York at all, would be like the 8th Avenue or something. So my grandmother grew up right here. I'm going to show you some pictures of that street. It's a combination of sort of nice, tall, like these are 4 or 5 stories high, with commercial properties on the ground floor down here. And my husband and I looked in this was again, maybe 20 years ago. So there was no online reservations to be made. We had a guidebook for Germany and Berlin. I looked in the guidebook for a place to stay, and unbelievably, there was a place to stay in the building next door to where my grandmother had grown up. Sort of hard to comprehend. So when I was there, so this wasn't her building. Actually the space that would have been hers was empty. It had probably gotten a direct hit in the war, had been bombed, hadn't been rebuilt, but it was, I felt like that looked more probably like it had looked when she had lived there than some of the buildings were looking. So they were all pristine, and they didn't have these little decks on them and things like that. And sure enough, when I showed that to my dad, he said, "Yeah, that's what it looked like. That's what it looked like." Okay, cool. And then inside, it was beautiful. This was a staircase. Whoops. This was the staircase going up. They didn't live in the whole building. The building like had four or five floors, and each floor was one apartment. But these were the stairs going up. That was the dining room. And again, when I showed my dad, he said, "Yeah." And this was, oh, sorry, that's, I think, my phone. Bad girl. Yeah, he said, "Yeah, that's what the courtyard looked like." And so we had a nice time there. So going on to my grandfather, unfortunately, I don't know the address of where he grew up. I didn't ever get that. Somehow couldn't find it in our records. I'm sure if we dug deeper, we could. But one of the things that really surprised me is I had heard when that one of the reasons he was able to go back to New York was because he had done, I think I said, done some of his medical training in New York City. But I figured, well, it's maybe like a year of residency or a postgraduate year. My cousin just sent me some materials, and in those materials were records indicating that he had done 4 full years of medical school in New York City. He had also gone to medical school in Germany, I presume, because I saw some things referring to that. But he finished medical school on June 1912 in New York. So guess what? When he went back, he was actually able to get relicensed in medicine. He practiced out of his home, which they did back in those days. And when I went and visited them, they, there was his medical equipment cabinet, and the place my grandmother had to stay if he had a patient and things like that. But it was certainly one of the reasons why he was able to more easily, more comfortably able to go. Whoops, no. Okay. Going back to them as a couple now. This is the Neue Synagogue of Berlin, the mid Berlin, the new synagogue of Berlin. It says new, but it was originally built in the early 1800s, I understand. And that is where my grandparents got married. And when my husband and I were in Berlin, again, we had been told something about this by my father, that where it was, in which synagogue it was. And so we looked for it to find that it was, here we are, it had been destroyed. It had been burnt in the 1930s, I presume, I understand. Here we are in the mid-90s, and it was just finally being repaired. So this is the outside of it. You can see if I go back, you'll see how the similarity, the same, that's the same. The building next door is the same. And we were able to go in. And I'm not sure where they would have carried out the wedding ceremony, but this is perhaps where it would have been. That was under repair. Yeah. So what is a little strange, but I want to share it because it is a frame for what I'm going to be speaking to, is my father doesn't ever remember having gone to synagogue. His parents were not particularly observant. And he wasn't bar mitzvahed. He didn't get any religious training within Judaism. Nor did his sister. So now, one of the things he was also able to give me was the address of where they lived, where he and my grandmother lived. Now, this slide's a little complicated. If you've been to Berlin, are you aware of the KaDeWe department store? Okay, this is like one of the top department stores in all of Europe, from what I understand. If you go online, you can look it up, and it's amazing. Where their apartment was, their house rather, was, whoops, oops, sorry. Oh dear, no. Good. So here is the KaDeWe. This is Gefürstendamm. This is Gefürstenstrasse. If you see that little triangle there, which doesn't have a building on it, that's where their home was, and it wasn't there anymore. It had been bombed, presumably, or burnt or something. So I couldn't actually see that. But my father didn't say anything to me about KaDeWe. But when I talked to him after I got back, I said, oh, Dad, you know, it was, thank you, that was really interesting. And when we were coming, we were moving on from having found where your property was, we walked down the street next to it, down here, and we got to this lovely park. At that point, it was more a total park than it, because we're talking 25 years ago. And I said, and there was a fair, a food fair going on. There was a food market. There were vendors. It was really lovely. We enjoyed it. And it was across the street from that department store. We didn't have time to go in it, unfortunately, but the KaDeWe. And I said, do you know where I mean? He said, of course I know where you mean. And I said, and I don't remember what day it was that I was there. He said, well, was it Tuesday? That's the day they had the market. And I said, you know what? It was. When he was 16 years old, which was the last time he was in Germany, that was where they went the day they had the market, at this park, and where his mother would go to get fresh vegetables. So just sort of weird connections. Oh, there's the KaDeWe and the, yeah, and the that's taking a picture from the park toward the KaDeWe. And there are some little stalls there, but when I was there, it was far, far more. I mean, the whole thing was like filled with vegetable stalls. Okay, so to come back to Berlin. That's a picture. Anyone know what this is? The Reichstag. That's the Reichstag. Back before the Reichstag fire, before it was damaged, when I was there in 95 or so, it looked sort of fancier, but it was new. So one of the things that I'm sharing is that my great uncle, who was Kurt Rosenfeld, was very politically active, and he was indeed a member of the Reichstag from about the time after World War I up until the late 20s. He was also the lawyer who represented Rosa Luxemburg in her trial, who probably you may have heard of. He was the Attorney General of Prussia briefly. And at the time that he lost his election, partly because he broke away from the primary socialist communist party to form another party that was a little less extreme, and he didn't win his seat. But he went back to being a lawyer. He was actually in partner with his daughter, which was a little unusual, Hilda Rosenfeld. And one of the things that he did when I was looking, I didn't know really anything about him. I knew he sort of was important, but my grandparents never talked about him. So he was the husband of he was my great uncle by marriage. His wife was my great aunt. That he was just, because he was in New York by that point when they got there. He was in New York, and they said, well, he was just one of those communist socialists, and we didn't really, click with him. But I went over, probably a good 10, 15 years ago to the ISU library to say, I want to find out a little bit more about my family. And one of the people I'd like to know about is somebody named Kurt Rosenfeld. Can you help me with that? Because again, this is pre-Google. So maybe it's a little more than 20. I got a call back. You've got to come over. They had 2 Time magazine entries about him. One was his obituary, which was a half page in Time magazine, which is something, in which he was referred to as the Clarence Darrow of Germany. And the other was an earlier story from 1932 covering a trial of where Hitler had sued a newspaper, a sort of socialist newspaper in Berlin, for libel because they had called Hitler out. This was the second of his 3 elections in 1932. The third one was when he actually won enough to get into government to form partnerships. And he sued the newspaper for raising money in Italy. And that was, of course, illegal, like it would be illegal here. And Rosenfeld was the lawyer representing the newspaper. And the other article was about how when Rosenfeld called Hitler to the stand, Hitler started screaming at him and asking him sort of pointed, difficult questions, started screaming at him and saying, you da-da-da Jew, I'm not going to answer any of your da-da-da questions. And the judge found Hitler in contempt of court and fined him and threw the case out. Of course, that didn't make Rosenfeld one of Hitler's friends. But it was in 1933, at the time of the Reichstag fire, when there's different stories, but certainly one of the feelings is that Hitler's people set the fire in order to frame Jews and took and arrested somebody saying that this is the person who set the fire. Well, and also started arresting people all over the place. And my uncle was afraid he was going to be he was on the list, on the short list. And he and his daughter were out of the country within a week after that, to Switzerland and then to England and finally to the US. Now, going back to something a little more fun, I'm looking at the time, I'm going to need to move a little quickly here. Back to that, where my grandmother grew up, I have to say, this is a complete aside, but it's sort of like my connection also ongoing with Germany. On this map, this was where, more or less, where my grandmother's house she grew up in was. And right on the next street, 1 block away, if you will, is a museum for Katja Kollwitz. How many of you know who Katja Kollwitz is? Okay, she's an artist. Thank you. At the time, she was one of the most prominent women artists in Europe. And this is a museum in her honor. Here are some of, I honestly, well, I'm going to finish the story quickly. Here are two of her pieces. She probably knew my uncle. She was a member also of the Socialist Democratic Party, very actively involved in it. And these are the kinds of work she did, very humanistically oriented, very, very much trying to reach out and support people who were struggling. That's a piece I own. I bought it. I bought it when the ISU art department was deacquisitioning things. And there was a silent auction and I got it. Or it wasn't a silent, it was an actual auction. And I bought it. And I didn't know who Katja Kovacs was. I'd never heard her name. And it just drew me. It just drew me. And it's actually quite large, like this. And I did find out it isn't worth that much because it is a print and it isn't signed, but it is genuine. And again, wait a minute. This is someone who probably knew my uncle, my great uncle, and that my grandmother grew up one block away from where her museum is. So I had to share that. So to continue. So back to Kurt Rosenfeld though. So Rosenfeld fled the country. He also went to England, waited for some connections to make his way to John, one of my grandfather's brothers, sponsored him to come to the US. He was already in the US for other reasons. And this picture is, as you know, who is, that's Kurt on this side. Who is that? Very good. Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein was a friend of the family. Actually on both sides of the family. And this is a lake in, somebody told me when they saw that picture that it was the Wannsee, which is a huge lake on the side, one side of Berlin, that in fact, my grandmother's family had a house on. They had money, they were bankers. Their family name was Arnold. But when I looked at the history of when they both left Germany, it couldn't have been then there. This was either in England or it was in the US. So, this, just to give you, this is my dad on the right. That's my aunt, his sister on the left, in London while they're waiting, while my dad was at City and Guilds and they're waiting to get their visas approved. Again, just to show you. And this is a picture from about 10 years later. I'm skipping ahead. This is my grandparents, my father's parents, as you saw their pictures before. This is my grandmother on my mother's side. My parents were engaged at that point and planning to get married. They weren't coming home for the wedding. And so I'm guessing that my dad's parents went up to visit them and went up to visit my grandmother. Unfortunately, my grandfather had the German part of the family had passed away already. My grandmother, I think, is about 70 at that point. She lived for another 20 years. And so this is up, this is there. And this is the certificate of marriage for my parents. That'd be sort of fun to put in. But before, oh, actually, I meant to, I wanted to do this before I got there, because this is about, okay, we're going to go back to that. I found, actually just found, going through some of the things that I had, a letter from my father to his parents in New York about his plans for marriage. Now, they knew he was getting married, but I wanted to share some of it. I've already written you that we are going to have a church wedding. I think I also wrote you that Lou, my mother Louise, is a Methodist, and that both she and especially her mother have been very active in the Belmont Methodist Church. We have talked about the problem of religion, that is, that it is no problem for us. I realize while others probably does not care too much about it one way or the other, you probably cannot help feeling at least a little unhappy that I am not marrying a Jewish girl. Perhaps that's okay. Although I can't deny entirely that the convenience of not immediately sticking out in a country which has quite a lot of anti-Semitism, meaning the US, has nothing to do with it. It is really that I've never felt that Jewish, or don't think I ever would. Perhaps that's because of my lack of religious training when I was a child, as I mentioned. Anyway, I'm going to skip a little bit. I admire Jews who have not lost their identity, but I don't feel that way myself. And I feel perhaps because of the absence of childhood religious training, that religious belief, if anything, is something everyone has to work out for themselves. Anyway, neither Lou nor her mother have any objections on religious grounds. And even if you can't entirely approve, I hope at least you will understand. Understand that I'm not trying to run away from anything, but that to the extent that I feel any need for religion, I have found in the New Testament many of the great truths. And to a large extent, these are universal, and that they transcend any formally organized denomination, being found in Buddhism and other religions of the East too. Remember, he had been in Japan for 5 years at that point. My stay in Japan, where everything and everybody is supposed to be so different, but they're not, has convinced me that all the more that people really are the same all over the world. So to finish up, I'm finishing up actually with something that is a little more, yes, and that's his sister's kids, who never were told they were Jewish. I knew my grandparents. I knew about the Jewish background. I knew my Jewish cousins who lived in New Jersey. They had never been told they were Jewish. But remember, his sister lived through Christeller. His sister lived through a much worse 3 years than he did. I know we all should honor Madeleine Albright, who just passed away. She did not know that her family was Jewish until after she was an adult and working. I'm not sure I'm remembering exactly, but because of this, I was very struck with that. They did not tell her that she was Jewish. So now, I am finishing up with something that is going to be a little more painful. I went to Auschwitz about 4 years ago. I had been told by my parents, by my father, that they had not lost any friends, that they had not lost any relatives. everybody had gotten out in the family. But again, my dad was 16 when he left. And I never thought to ask his parents this, of course. They died when I was a little kid. So I'm at Auschwitz. I felt it was a very, very powerful experience. And then we went on the last day, went into the building where they have the books, printed books of people who were killed in the Holocaust. If you haven't been there, the books go like from that wall to that wall, open on two sides. They're unbelievable. And I thought, I'm going to look for some names of people, who I know, who are like friends, who I know are Jewish, and to see if they're there, and who also have some background in Germany. I'm just going to see. It wasn't finding anybody until I looked under Christeller. I found a whole page. I found a whole page. And if you see Berlin, there's Berlin. My guess is these were cousins. And I have to say, one of the things I've done, I've been to Germany several times. When I've been there, I've looked up in the phone book, back when there were phone books, looked in the phone book for Christeller, never found anybody named Christeller anywhere. This is the next page where I highlighted some. And this one, this is, here. This is the last one. Walter Christeller, born in 1900, Berlin, Germany, murdered in Auschwitz. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. I mean, I felt like I was feeling what I knew other people had been feeling when they were there, that I hadn't particularly, because I'd been told we hadn't lost relatives there, but I think we probably had. This, I think that slipped down. That highlighter was on Walter Christeller because I looked him up simply because he was the last one there and found this. One of the things they've done in Berlin and are continuing to do, they were doing it when I was there 25 years ago, but they're continuing to do, is create these stones, these plaques that are on stones for people who indeed lost their lives. So here is that Walter that you just saw in the book, on the list in the book. The birth dates match. And now I'm going to share one more thing, and then we're over a few minutes. Again, this feels maybe a little bit more like a brag, but it's the other side of the family. It was my grandmother's, okay, I'm going to go to that, and then I'm going to explain why I would be showing you this. How many of you ever watched Nature? Yeah, I love it. It's on PBS. The other side of the family were this family of bankers. My grandmother's grandmother was, she was from that family. The last name is Arnold. I think I mentioned that. And they were, they had a bank that was taken over by Hitler in Germany, but they had also set up a branch of it in New York. And that was partly why there were some relatives in New York, and they were able to keep hold of. These are the primary sponsors for the nature show. It's been on about 25 years, actually. And here is the obituary for Henry Arnold, who only died a few years ago. And he was a banker, but he was also a tremendous philanthropist in many, many ways. And I hadn't really known this, and I found this a few days ago, just trying to prepare for this. So I am very glad I did. And I wanted to leave things on a little better note than, than with the previous few slides. So.
Well, thank you so much, Jean, for sharing this. I think it's quite interesting to think about all of these things that make the world such a small place. Like, you know, we always say it's very small and you never know who you run into, and you have all of these stories of these great connections that just so happen to be, you know, just such a small world, but it's crazy. I do have a question to start off, and then we'll see if anybody else has any questions. So it sounds like your family was quite international, which maybe helps with being able to move and leave your homeland, but kind of coming back to that, fleeing your homeland, you started so profoundly. What if you had to leave everything you knew and you really felt like this was your home? Even if you weren't super patriotic, this is still your home. You still celebrate the 4th of July or whatever. Did they ever really, like, how hard was it, even though they were kind of worldly, how hard was it to kind of assimilate into the United States culture?
I think it was challenging. I remember when I visited, you know, I did visit my grandparents who lived in New York, in Manhattan. If you know Manhattan at all, up on the Upper West Side, there's a place called the Cloisters. They were a few blocks from that, but I think that they lost those connections. My dad my grandfather rather did work as a physician, so I expect he had more of those connections. But no, it wasn't the same. No. I know it wasn't the same.
So do we have any questions here? Trent, I don't know if you walked out, if there's any questions online.
There are no questions online yet.
Yes, okay, thank you. Anybody else have some questions? Yes.
So your father never had a desire to go back to Berlin?
It's a good question. Thank you. His mother went back, but he did not. And the trip that I showed you the pictures from, we tried to get him to come with us or to join us over there. We said we would pay for his travel, and he did not want to go.
Well, he didn't want to go back to Germany, or he was just not a traveler?
Oh, he was a traveler.
Okay.
He didn't want to go back to Germany. I think he felt like he wanted to keep the memories of what it was when he was there. I think, honestly, had he gone back, he would have been glad he would have gone back, but he said no, he did not want to go back. And he was still he was in his 60s. He could have certainly gone with us. Yeah.
It's interesting, and I'm just going to add to the question. It's interesting because it was so many years later. I think going back in, like I think you said, the early 90s compared to going back in the 50s or the 60s would be two different questions. So
That's yes.
Kind of surprising in a way.
And I think my grandmother passed away in the late 50s, so she went back in the 50s.
Oh,
yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
For other people that want to access their family records that maybe have European ancestry, are those records easily accessible?
Yeah, I was astounded what I could find online now.
I'm sorry, can you just say the question?
Oh,
again?
the question is for people who may be interested in looking for exploring their family records like I have shared with you. I've just been really surprised at what I can find online now, and more than say 5 years ago when I was the last time I actually had been trying to look in depth. Yeah, more and more. Thanks. Any other questions?
Not a question, but a comment online. This was a great presentation. Thank you so much for sharing your family connections. You speak very knowledgeably about.
Thank you.
I bet in a way, if anybody's ever done genealogy, it's always interesting to kind of see where you're from, and this it's just an extra layer when you have to add in the Holocaust. I can't imagine what it was like for you to see the Book of Names and to really find that. Having seen the Book of Names, it's already an overwhelming thing to see, and then to see a name in it that like when we've gone, we found Eva's mom and dad in the Book of Names, and so
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's very powerful. And the stumbling stones, the Stolperstein, am I close? They like Eva's family also has Stolperstein, so they're doing it not only in Germany but in all of Europe. So they're placing these stones in honor of the victims of the Holocaust.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Yes.
So when you went to like the camps and stuff, but what was some of the things going through your mind?
When you were at the camps?
At Auschwitz and Buchenwald. Well, just to see firsthand what was going on, and to what had gone on, to see it, especially in Buchenwald, where you've got these huge barns of people were being basically stored, and the railroad train getting, yes, you get off of that and you go that way and you're going right into the extermination chambers. You go this way and you're going to be put to work, or if you were a child like Ava was, you're through other things. Yeah, it's a very, very moving place. Very moving place. Even though I didn't know that there was probably a personal connection there, which I then found out. I actually did make the recommendation that they take people to the Book of Names earlier in the trip, and not the last morning.
Interesting. It is always the last thing that we do. It's just part of how the Auschwitz guides set up the tours.
Yeah, yeah.
But
It would have really, the whole thing would have been much more powerful
Different
if I'd
for you,
seen
for sure.
seen those begin. Yeah. Plus, I wasn't able to process it. Yeah.
I could see that.
Any other? Yes.
As Americans, a lot of us are obsessed with where we came from and our homelands, and we kind of have like almost a loyalty to those homelands. And I don't know, it's a curiosity, how do you feel? Do you feel like Germany betrayed you? Do you feel like Germany, does that make sense what I'm asking? It's just that we have no really, we're a melting pot, so.
Yeah, it's a great question. How do we understand where our identity may lie? And I don't know how, whether I'm unusual or not. I mean, I know lots of people here. I've lived here in Terre Haute for 30 years, and I meet people all the time whose families have been here for several generations, and this is where they know, and this is where their heart is. I've not only lived elsewhere in the world, I've lived in about 10 different places in the US. And so I think both of those, I think part of what is a little bit more unusual about being an American is that isn't that unusual, to have lived a lot of different places and to appreciate that complexity and richness of cultural variation, but nevertheless the common elements that are there for all of us. Yeah.
I think we have one more question online.
Yeah, it's from Charlie. He's asking, is it possible to find out if there are any stumbling stones in the name of your family? And do you know how to?
Oh, that's a good question. I did not look for that, but when I put in Christeller, I didn't find any. So it may.
What are stumbling stones?
Oh,
Go back to the picture.
the picture,
It's a, she showed you a picture, so it's a
Right, yeah.
Stolperstein, they
Right.
call it, it's a stumbling stone, but they just place these just in honor of it. They usually try to put it
There.
where the home was. So
so those are embedded
They're
like in
in
a
a
stone
sidewalk.
path or in a sidewalk.
Where the people live.
try to
Yes,
put it near.
near,
that.
but not, yeah.
I think, I don't quote me correctly, but I feel like I've Googled this before, and I think there's a website that identifies where
Yeah,
they are.
actually, I thought I had put in a photo of where this, of this. And, but they do say, actually, there was a comment made that they were not showing where specific ones were.
Oh.
But if you're a family member, I would hope you could find that out. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I think our lesson from tonight is that you make the most out of the situation that you're dealt with. And unfortunately, Jean's family could see that it was not a safe place to live, and they moved on and really made the most out of their new surroundings and did the best that they could. So I just want to tell you, our Be the Change speaker series wraps up next month. It will be our very last one. We follow the school calendar. And so it will be next month, but it's only a week and a half. So please come back, or please tune in online. It's Monday, May 9th at 5 p.m. And this is Jason Francisco, and he is a photographer. He's traveled Eastern Europe, photographing these places of trauma and what they look like today. And so the topic is wrestling with memory. And so it's a little bit unique for us, but I think it will still be a powerful presentation. And so other than that, we thank you so much for being here, and safe travels home, and have a great evening.
Oh, when you ended those.
Oh.